might actually briefly refer to my other presentation, my BSA one, since I'm in the subculture group, because this one I made for methods. So since I'm in subcultures, you might find it a bit boring. It's just words and there's no pictures, so I might quickly flip across to this one so I can show you a couple of images, give you an idea of what's going on. So yeah, as I said, my idea was to talk about methods today. I entered this for the methods stream. I will put that up on slideshow quickly. So I just wanted to contribute a bit to the literature on reflexivity and emotion in subcultural fieldwork. So I was, as it says, observing steroid users in gyms in the southwest of England. That was the research project for my PhD. And obviously, qualitative subcultural research, I was using a lot of ethnographic methods and a sort of grounded theory framework to develop an understanding of the context in which the drug use, which was the primary focus, occurred, and also the subcultures and how they interacted with the gym space and with each other, and how this contributed to the steroid use itself. So it was based on my immersion within gym environments and then talking to people about their experiences in the gym and about their experiences using drugs. And really the project came about because I had been training in gyms for some time and I had some of the body capital required to be able to fit in and deal with people in these environments and get them to talk to me. So as I've noted, this methodology, it leads to a piece that reflects a lot of the realities experienced by steroid users and gym users. But it's also very subjective because it's conditional on my positionality in the field and my emotional interpretation. So really I just wanted to explore a few examples of where that really helped me to critically reflect and refine the findings of my work. So just a bit of context on the broader findings of the research. What I found was that you can broadly split steroid users into different classes, and this is where I'll refer you to those images I was saying about. So steroid users, the most disciplined users who follow an organised pattern of use, who are very informed, they tend to be the sportsmen, these powerlifter types. And you can see I've commented there about how it's also dictated by their conceptions of masculinity. They have a very sort of conservative or orthodox conception of a man should be strong and a man needs to be capable, and they conceive image training and shaving body hair and tanning. They think that's very feminine, they're very critical of that, and meanwhile, on the other end of the spectrum, those who tend to use the steroids and fat burners in much higher doses, who come across as more reckless, they tend to either be this lad culture, which is a very specific subculture, who are engaged in binge drinking and club drug use and seeking sex, sort of their primary motivations for getting in shape, and there is a lot of the body sculpting, a lot of posting pictures of nights out, as I've used the example there. But there is a broader culture that I sort of termed it roughly hedonic use, those whose focus is sex, materialism, consumption, which is distinct. And now both of these can be kind of conceived as forms of hegemonic masculinity, if you wanted to use Connell's framework. But obviously very different manifestations of it, and very different drug use, very different attitudes as a result. As I've noted, there's a spectrum wherein more casual, image-focused weight trainers fall in the middle. So just to highlight, this is the essential findings of the work, is we have the disciplined approach falls with this more sort of conservative idea of masculinity. The more casual approach to drug use really goes with this, what could broadly be termed muscle masculinity. Is you're showing off your muscles to show how masculine you are. And of course, to an extent, I would say the powerlifters are doing the same, but they're doing it by showing how much weight they can lift, as opposed to how my body looks. But obviously, in both cases, it's body capital. Both can be seen as on this same spectrum of hegemonic masculinity. So in terms of my position in the research, actually this was a research project that I undertook because of my prior engagement in the gym. So I started casually training in the gym when I was about 16, and then when I was 21, one of my friends got into powerlifting. And I started training with him and did a couple of regional competitions. So I was sort of, in some ways, perceiving things from the powerlifter perspective because I had been involved in that subculture. But at the same time, I was removed because I've got a spinal disorder, which meant I could never lift the kind of weights that a lot of the powerlifters do. So that meant I was somewhat more critical in my analyses. So that's my biography and how that interacts with the narratives that I explore. So I just wanted to show, I've got 3 examples of incidents where my emotional engagement and interaction really kind of led to my revising what I had previously thought from just observing in the gym. Obviously, I'm not the only researcher to do research into a subculture that they have some connection with already. Quite a few subcultural researchers are researching their friends. I've put a few examples on the board, and there are ethical issues which need to be navigated in these instances. And as Coffey says, this can really sharpen our abilities for critical reflection because it does make us think on a different level when we're really emotionally engaged. So in my research, I had this dynamic of negotiating friendship ethics, and at the same time, I would have people approach me in the gym because they knew I was researching steroids, because I was very open about what my research project was and let people know. And people would come to me and ask for advice. So I also had this element of I was an authority or a perceived authority on how do I use steroids safely, you know, what steroids can I use. And I've likened it to Shane Blackman in his article on emotional imagination, saying when he was in the field and he had young homeless men, the council had sort of tried to move them on, and they wanted to write a letter to the council, and they had asked Professor Blackman to write it on their behalf, and he said, actually, this is a very awkward position to be in, because as the perceived authority, I sort of have undue power over, and it's negotiating the ethics of at what point do you say I need to step back, and at what point do you say I want to help and be as good a sort of research friend as possible. So to use an example of this from my work, Mark was a personal trainer in one of these commercial type gyms. Now, the gyms that different subcultures are involved in actually really reflect their sort of archetypes and behaviours. So if we can see on the left there, that's your typical powerlifting gym, just squat racks in a row, there's no mirrors, it's very raw. And on the right you have this commercial gym which is a lot more polished. I'm sure a few of you have trained in these types of gyms. And those you get a blend of some of the casual trainers who don't necessarily fall into these subcultures, as well as these types of the workout culture and the lag culture will also, and very often it depends on the time of day. You could almost do an ethnography of gyms by the time periods in which people train. And I have met a few people who deliberately avoid training at certain times because they want to steer clear of these groups. So Mark was in one of these commercial gyms, and I met him 2011, so before this research project officially started, and he had always said to me he was proud to be drug-free. He was very anti-drug because he believed that you shouldn't just be training to look good, to show off. He was very much of the mindset that training should be about a healthy lifestyle and about self-betterment. And this had been his attitude for as long as I knew him. And about 3 years after we had met, he came to me in the gym one day and he said, look, actually I'm very concerned because I'm losing money because other trainers in the gym were taking steroids and then they were advertising their services based on that body capital. They were portraying to clients, this is the body you can get if you follow my training regimen. And of course they were just lying and misrepresenting because they were all on steroids, but they wouldn't admit it. And Mark actually used the phrase, he said to me, it's very hard to run a business honestly when other people aren't being honest. And he sort of said, look, I've got a job on the way. I'm not making enough money. Do I take steroids? Do I take, well, actually not steroids. He asked about the drug clenbuterol, which is a fat stripper, because he thought, maybe I don't have to quite take steroids. Maybe I just need to get the six-pack. So he asked me, could you give me any reason why I shouldn't take this? And as I said, this put me in a very awkward position, because to some extent I had power over Mark in that instance. He was coming to me and asking me to tell him what to do, because he perceived me as an authority. And as a researcher, that's a very awkward position to be in, but also as a friend to Mark, I almost wanted to actually tell him, you shouldn't do this, and give him that advice, which I knew really, ethically, it was not quite right to give him that advice. So this really helped me reflect on how my own position within the research and talking to people in gym environments was actually affecting the findings, and just how my being there was really changing what was happening in the gym. And in this instance, luckily I was able to intuit from how Mark phrased the question. He said, can you give me a reason I shouldn't? So I just honestly sent him some research articles, thinking, I am performing my ethical duty as a friend in that instance, but I am doing it in a sort of research function. And I think there are these sort of morally grey areas where we do just have to try and feel out and through emotion determine what the best thing we can do is. So that was the starkest example of that sort of ethical issue in my research. The next, think of hidden ethnography, and Shane Blackman says that very often things which happen in the field and would actually contribute to our findings and really help people to better understand realities experienced, they get left out of work, and this is what hidden ethnography is. He says sometimes this is due to fears of inappropriateness or even being overly concerned with consent. So in the case of my work, when I'm talking about the lad culture and their very hedonic lifestyle and the materialism, conspicuous consumption, it does often come across as very critical in my writing, because even though I'm aware, obviously it's a very working class subculture, so it is oppositional to middle class norms, so in spite of the materialism, it is nonetheless sort of a reaction to structural oppression almost. The problem is, because I left out a specific interaction which really made clear to me, actually what we perceive when we just look at this subculture, this is almost a veneer, that resulted in some hidden ethnography in my thesis. So I just wanted to address this interaction that really brought home to me. Actually, there is something underlying this lad culture and this binge drinking and seeking sex and this conspicuous lifestyle that maybe once it's understood and acknowledged would give people a bit of a different perspective on it. So as I've noted, even though Carl, who was a member of lad culture, we have very different interests, engage in very different things, but I found him extremely likable, and I think this is often the case in subcultural researchers. Researchers actually find they genuinely like the people who they're working with. But initially I did just see Carl. He's a member of lad culture, so I took him as being, he's a bit shallow, he's a bit materialistic, even though very, very nice guy, really got on with him. But then one night, Carl was working security. Very often the research was taking place in South Devon, not a lot of great jobs for young working class guys. A lot of them do wind up doing these sort of jobs such as security. I did security myself for 4 years, so I've been in that position. And he was working on the door, and one of the ways that, again, I'm a rural working class guy myself, so I have similar interests. One of the ways I got them to talk to me was I would talk about the UFC, cage fighting, and I would that's how we would get interaction started. I'd say, oh, did you see the event? And anyway, in this instance, this happened soon after Ronda Rousey lost her title, and she went on the Ellen show and she talked about she had considered killing herself after it had happened. And I was talking to Carl, and he starts off saying about this incident, that's not what a champion does, you don't say that. And I sort of pushed back. I said, well look Carl, I don't like to judge people like that, you don't know what's going on in their life. And he said to me, it just instantly made me rethink all my preconceptions, because he said, look, we've all thought about doing it, but you don't do it. And that just made me realise, like, I had this vision of this perception of lag culture, because they're all about the social media, they're all about showing off. I hadn't even been thinking about actually underneath the surface. Very often there are these sort of dark underlying trends, and he's trying to almost escape this. And we had this conversation, and he was very honest and very open with me about, he was very concerned, he didn't know where he was going with his life, and he wanted some sort of guidance. So again, this idea of me almost as an authority, and this blur between research friendship and friendship, to use Cotterell's term. And this just really made me reassess lad culture and some of the behaviours I had witnessed. But of course, because this wasn't a conversation where I had gone up and we had been talking about my research and where I had gotten consent, I didn't initially include it in my doctoral thesis because I thought it was inappropriate. So even though throughout I'm sort of making references to, well, of course, this subculture is, it's a working class subculture, and it is somewhat oppositional, I didn't necessarily have the depth in that work to really reflect these realities. So Shane Blackman was actually my examiner, and that's what made me realise. He said to me, look, there seems to be some hidden ethnography in your work. You need to talk through this, and you need to make clear some of these themes that you're hinting at, but really make them explicit. So that was a very powerful conversation for me, and really affected how I saw things after that moment. So to lighten the tone slightly, because that was a bit of a heavy example, talking about Stephen Ling's idea of edge work and how engaging in encounters that can expose you to an observable threat to one's physical or mental well-being can help bring live sociology to work. And as I said, I have been in gym environments really since about 2010, in those sorts of hardcore gym environments, and I have been training even earlier, since about 16, just doing very casual weight training. So I knew a lot of steroid users before I started the project. I knew steroid suppliers. So I had this impression from the ones I had met that they just drift into steroid supply, because all the ones I had interacted with have been powerlifters or bodybuilders who started buying steroids for themselves, and then they started supplying friends, and then they started supplying their gyms. So broadly, I went into the field perhaps with a bit of hubris, thinking, well, there's not really any risk in this environment, because I know steroid suppliers, they're not dangerous guys at all. And this changed slightly when my friend Harry took me to meet his friend and his steroid supplier, Tyson, who actually, it turned out, wasn't the typical gym-based supplier who had drifted into it that I had been expecting. He was a guy who had previously been involved in selling Class A drugs, and Harry told me after the fact that, he was addicted to ketamine and it sent him a bit paranoid, and actually he's got this really list of, I can't talk about it too much, I don't think, but Harry basically told me, that guy I introduced you to and didn't tell me in advance, he's a bit of a nutter. And I was like, thanks very much. So at the end of our interview, it had been not an interview to start with, because not only had he refused to let me record him, which is fair enough, I'd had a steroid supplier previously make that request, so that was nothing out of the ordinary, but he made me put my phone in my bag and then put my bag about 20 feet away to make sure I couldn't possibly be secretly recording him. So he did come across as a bit odd in that instance, and then once we'd finished the interview, I was like, well, thank you very much for talking to me. He said, no problem, and if I get any blowback, I'm going to send the boys around your place. And that's why I brought it up with Harry in the car, and I said, yeah, that was a bit of a tense moment. So this, drawing on C. Wright Mills's idea of considering extremes by thinking of opposites, really, Tyson was the extreme supplier to me and really did make me rethink, okay, perhaps a lot of suppliers are guys who drifted into it, but you do get these sort of types who have made the rational decision. They were selling Class A drugs, and they thought, now there's a booming market in steroids, now I can move into that and make a killing. And they do sort of bring across the old mindset. So that was a bit of edge work for me. So really briefly, just to conclude, obviously, as I've said, these experiences allow me to better understand the cultural environment of the gym, and as well as how my own biography interacted with the findings. And I think talking about these sorts of moments in subcultural research really does bring the experiences of the field to life and sort of brings life sociology and encourages Fichte. But as I've noted, that this research is in fact ongoing, because another piece of hidden ethnography is that I struggle to recruit women for the sample. And really, at the end of my work, I thought, this is some great data, but it's nearly all talk about men. So again, this research project is ongoing. I am going to look to recruit more women and get their perspective on these subcultures in the gym and the realities of the cultural environment of the gym. And of course, just a quick note, the grounded theory methodology does account for these sorts of changes and allows you to always adapt your theory. So thank you very much. Well, so initially it was a project specifically looking at steroid use, and drawing on the idea, as Shane Blackman said, fears of inappropriateness. There is an element of, because steroids are masculinizing, if I walk up to women and start asking, have you used steroids? There is an implication in that, I think you look like a man. So I was a bit nervous to actually go approach women and talk about steroid use in that instance. And as it's broadened into more of a subcultural piece, looking at gym cultures and less at steroids specifically, that's sort of opened options where now I can approach women without that inappropriate, that awkwardness. But certainly in the early stages of the research, I only spoke to one woman who was a powerlifter, who I already knew was on steroids, because it was just a lot of, awkwardness and pressure in approaching women. And then in the more commercial type gym environments, especially when we're talking the sorts of times when the younger women tend to train, who you might get more distinct data from, is also the sort of time when you get the real lag culture types in, who train in a big group and are quite, I would say, dominance-oriented. If you think about their sort of masculine conception, they're all hogging the various machines, they're all crowding around the mirror, and there is a certain vibe of possession of females when you have a lot of young men around and you have young women training with them. And there was also almost a risk of, if I approach a woman and she takes it the wrong way and there are a lot of very aggressive young men around, is there also risk in that? Which again might have given me some more interesting stories for this portion. But in the initial part of the research, that was another concern. So I have had to make a conscious effort for this next part of the research to really say, no, I do have to engage women more to make sure that actually my findings are reflective of the realities of the cultural environment at the gym. So that is a possibility, but the problem is with this sort of snowballing, I've actually run into problems. I've had very minimal recruitment using that sort of snowballing method of trying to ask one person and then they have to pass it on. Because very frequently, I don't know if it's more they struggle to articulate what the precise research aims are relatively, because not everybody in the general population knows about ethnography and sociology. I've had minimal engagement on snowballing. So I have had a couple of good respondents I've picked up that way, but I find I have more success with direct approach. So it's more about being conscious of the ways in which I can engage women in the gym without there being that sort of risk that I've identified. That is, as I said near the start, but there's this sort of split between these disciplined and more casual trainers. And female bodybuilders sort of fall, you can see where I've got competitive bodybuilders, they're more towards the more hardcore end of the spectrum. So I'm still very interested in talking to female bodybuilders, but it's really getting those who are more in this sort of workout culture towards this end because I think that's where we're going to see more of the contrast with the men. Because what tends to happen up at the far end, as I said, I've spoken to a couple of female powerlifters, they actually tend to have very similar training goals, and they're very similar to the men. And there are obviously distinct differences, and there's some interesting contrast to be had there. But I think really the area where women need to be engaged in gym environments to really contribute to the literature is more towards this casual end of the spectrum.